Yeah. Let's just go.
All right. Like I said, Brian gave a really good introduction to this talk, although it wasn't on purpose. Just a quick overview of kind of our aquatic resources that we manage for fishing opportunities in Kansas. We do have 25, large federal reservoirs, 43 state fishing lakes, and, somewhere around 300 to 400 other small impoundments that we manage for fishing opportunities. And overall, this encompasses about 200,000 acres of standing water. We also have, a lot of river work that we do, although a lot of that work is kind of done in the ecological services shop. Fishing in Kansas is pretty big business. We have about 400,000 licensed anglers annually, and they spend about $210 million worth of money on trip-related and equipment expenses in a given year. So kind of nested within our agency's mission statement, we have our own fisheries division goals that include, conservation of sport, non-sport, and T&E species, the water they rely on and their habitats. And we also are charged with increasing fishing opportunity and also increased fishing success. And the way that we view this in our research section is that we, facilitate sound management. So if management or culture has a specific question that really needs kind of narrowed in on, that's what we do to facilitate management. Figure out how to get these. All right, I'm going to talk about a number of programs or projects that we're working on, but I think one of the most exciting and kind of relevant ones that I can talk about today is blue catfish. Our blue catfish research program has a lot of different angles that I'll touch on here today. Blue catfish are native to Kansas. They're a large river species. So prior to impoundment of a lot of our reservoirs, they were in our larger rivers like the Missouri River and Kansas River. Just recently, we introduced them into some of our large reservoirs. Milford was the first one, and I think that was the early 1990s or the late 80s that they were introduced into. Some of our other reservoirs have just been in the last 10 or 15 years. Blue catfish get huge, which makes them very exciting. This is our state record here from the Kansas River. It was just over 100 pounds. So a lot of 50, 60, 70, 80-pound fish are being caught in Kansas. In addition to getting big, they're delicious. Fisheries management agencies need to get a kind of a hold on is how to measure abundance. So we usually deal in relative abundance, catch per unit effort of a certain gear. The way that we sample blue catfish is with low frequency electrofishing. It's amazing. It's magical. You go out into the middle of a reservoir where you think blue catfish might be, you put electricity in the water, and sometimes hundreds or even thousands of these blue catfish float up. However, it is very effective, but it's also a highly variable gear, which kind of leads to a lot of uncertainty in our metrics. So you can have one of these stations where you catch 100 or 1,000, and then you go 100 yards down and do it again, and you don't catch anything for 5 stations. So kind of wrapping our head around what the actual abundance of these fish are is important for sound management. So what we decided to do was enact a mark recapture study design in a few different reservoirs. We've been doing this for about 3 years. We've done it at El Dorado, Milford, and Tuttle Creek. And what we ended up with were some pretty decent population estimates for these reservoirs. Not only, so what we did was we went out and tagged a bunch of these fish and had a lot of recapture events. And what we found was Milford, our most developed population, had about 8 of these 300 millimeter fish per acre, whereas some of our less developed populations like El Dorado and Tuttle Creek had, half as much or a quarter of the population of fish. However, these less developed populations do actually have more quality fish per acre than some of our more well-developed fisheries. But a lot of good information on abundance with this study. Other things that we can get at with our tagging data are how catchable these fish are to anglers. So anglers get a reward for reporting a tagged fish that they catch. And this graph here is kind of outlining how susceptible these fish are to angling. And you can see that susceptibility to angling increases pretty steadily from 8 to 40 inches. These are Milford data, by the way, and that shaded box is the 25 to 40 inch protected slot limit. But after about 40 inches, you can see that those fish just become super susceptible to angling. And some of the largest fish that we've tagged have been caught, 2 or 3 times. So again, that kind of helps our managers fine tune their management recommendations, especially in regard to these big and vulnerable fish. Another thing that we need to get a handle on in our fish populations is growth, and blue catfish is no different than any other species. If you don't know, you can age fish a lot like you age trees. They put down annular marks like this sectioned pectoral fin spine from a blue catfish right here. So, this fish would first winter, second winter, third, and so on. So this would be a 6-year-old blue catfish. And what we can do is compare and contrast our growth patterns, and that helps our managers kind of fine tune where they need harvest, where they need to protect harvest, and so forth. Another thing that has come up with blue catfish is that they're very popular for tournament anglers. We've had a lot of even national tournaments come into Milford, and they catch these fish and they can stay in live wells for most of the day. So understanding how well these fish handle that and how stressed out they are before the weigh-in is important to managing the fishery and managing tournaments. So Nick Kramer, our district fisheries biologist at Perry, did this really interesting study where he measured blood glucose as a surrogate for stress, and did a couple of different trials relating to how much flow through the live well we had, how much fresh water was going through there, how crowded the live wells were, and also how big the live wells were. And what he found was that that none of these factors had an influence on stress levels of blue catfish. So perhaps these fish are hardier than we thought, and can handle the stress of being in these live wells for these tournaments. Another angle that we research a lot in Kansas is the human dimensions of our fisheries. And we just started a new project collaborating with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They have some really excellent human dimensions researchers there. And what we want to do is kind of wrap our head around our catfish fisheries and how our anglers use those. So the objectives of this study are to kind of identify angler preferences, motivations, and opinions on our management and opportunities, because I've talked a lot about blue catfish, but we have, catfish fisheries for flathead catfish. This is the world record flathead catfish. It was caught from Kansas. So we have, world-class flathead catfish fishing. We also stock a lot of small channel catfish throughout the state in urban opportunities. So basically just understanding how our anglers perceive these programs is important. We also want to determine the economic impact of catfish angling. A lot of people probably think of catfish anglers as guys just sitting on the bank with some worms or some stink bait. But the truth is that our blue cat fisheries, like I said, are developing a nationwide following. And a lot of these, $100,000 rigs are coming into the state and being bought in the state. So wrapping our head around how important economically our fisheries are is also important to us. Shifting gears from blue catfish to another popular species of crappie, we recently undertook a project in cooperation with Emporia State and New Mexico State to understand our population dynamics and management of our crappies. We funded a graduate student on this one, and he sat down and aged about 5,000 or 6,000 crappies from about 50 populations. And as you might expect, here's the growth trajectories from that data. And we had a wide variety of growth rates of our crappies in Kansas. A lot of that variation can be described based on how big the reservoir is that those fish are coming from. So here's a list of our dynamic rate functions, and here's the delineation between small and large populations. Recruitment, like Brian referred to, this is just basically a metrics explaining how variable recruitment is. So in large reservoirs, our recruitment is a lot less variable, which is a good thing for crappies. Our growth is a lot higher in our larger reservoirs, which is good. Mortality is a lot higher. And you might think of mortality as a bad thing for fish populations, but for something like crappie that can, they have the propensity to overpopulate and stunt, mortality can actually be kind of a good thing. And also we have some information on abundance there. Basically, that's a lot of gibberish for saying that the biology of our crappie populations are they vary widely, and that regulations must be catered to each reservoir's population characteristics. Another hot topic as far as crappie management goes are bag limits. Our current statewide bag limit for crappies is 50 per angler per day. And a lot of people think that's too much. But here is a graph right here. And this is showing the number of crappie harvested per person and the frequency in thousands of people doing that. So you can see that a few people catch 50 and hardly anybody catches 20 to 50. And here's our 20 here. But to have a real biological meaning, to biologically reduce harvest by even 10%, we would have to decrease that bag limit to almost 10 fish. So basically the take-home message from this is that bag limits, are mainly a sociological issue and not biological, and we would have to decrease bag limits to be very restrictive to have kind of that biological impact on crappie populations. Another exciting, some exciting work that Scott Waters, our district biologist in Glen Elder, is doing is a walleye telemetry study. Now, telemetry studies are awesome. They can tell us where fish are going, what time of the year, how deep these fish are. And a lot of that information is useful to anglers. But what Scott was getting at here by implanting these 90 walleyes and tracking them for 3 years was kind of finding out their mortality rates and how to partition out that mortality between natural and fishing mortality. And what he found was that for an 18-inch or a legal walleye in Glen Elder, the survival rate in 2019 was 43%, and in 2020 it was 25%. So over those 2 years, about an average of about 30%. So that means that in a given year, an 18-inch walleye has a 7 out of 10 chance of dying in that given year, which is a lot. And he partitioned that out into fishing mortality and natural mortality based on how many of these receivers were reported by anglers. And it turns out that the fishing mortality accounted for about 44% of that, and natural mortality was about 26%. So we get a lot of questions and comments about our walleye regulations, and this gives us some really good information and insight into our mortality and what the proper regulations should be on our walleye populations. A little bit about invasive species really quickly. We have some really exciting projects going on with invasive carp in the Kansas River. We had some questions about the abundance of invasive carp in the Kansas River, but also these questions about, were these fish spawned here? Do they move in and out of the Kansas River into the Missouri River? And the way that we got at that is this technique called Otolith Microchemistry. So an otolith is an inner ear bone of a fish. It's a bony structure. Here's a picture of a sectioned otolith right here. And what we can do is we can run a laser and ablate a little piece of this otolith along this line. And then we can get the associated chemistry from that otolith. And that correlates well to the water in which they live. So this is just one instance for this otolith here. This is the data from the nucleus. This is where that fish was spawned, had a water chemistry reading of about, 3,000, this ratio of 3,000. It moved out of that water into a water that had, this chemistry, and it migrated back probably into the water at which it was spawned, and then migrated back into the water with this chemistry. So this fish was sampled from the Kansas River, so we can assume that this was the water chemistry and associated otolith chemistry from the Kansas River. So we could see that that fish probably lived in the Kansas River for many, many years, took a brief foray into somewhere else and then came back, but it was not spawned in the Kansas River. This is just one instance out of several hundred that we ran, but in general, our main findings were that most invasive carps were actually residents of the Kansas River, were spawned in the Kansas River, and therefore we can, have this idea that population management or decreasing the numbers of these invasive carp could actually, provide a biologically meaningful result. So Chris has done a really good job and obtained some funding to actually do some commercial fishing in the Kansas River to hopefully reduce the numbers and densities of these invasive carps. Really quickly, we've also done some work on Kansas crayfish in association with New Mexico State University and our ecological services partners in our agency, just to kind of get an idea of the distribution and species abundance and diversity of our crayfish species in our lentic environments, in our standing waters. We had really no idea, what the diversity of these crayfish were in these ponds. So again, we hired a graduate student to go do that. And what they found was that our diversity of our crayfish in our lakes was actually really low. I think they only caught 3 species, and all of them were either non-native or right on the fringe of their range. So this indicates that we may have some sort of problem with our crayfish populations, but they just finished year 1 of that study, and we'll have a lot more data coming out in year 2. A notable find were rusty crayfish, which are, kind of the highest profile invasive crayfish in North America. We did find a few of those individuals in one of the 10 study impoundments, and that's something that you might have seen in the news. So I know I went through that kind of quick and had some interruptions, but this list on the left of the slide is some of our other projects that we're working on. If any of those trip your trigger, feel free to email or contact any of us in our research office. This is our small group there. But with that, I think I'm about out of time. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Jeff, we did have a couple come here in the chat while you were talking here. The first is from Steve Adams. Is the creel survey data on crappie the number caught or kept?
That was harvest per angler. So that was harvested fish.
Gotcha. We got another comment on crappie from Jordan Hoffmeyer. I saw a great presentation a while back where decreasing bag limit for crappie to around 25 fish actually increased harvest. That was more achievable for anglers to limit out, which made them work a little harder to get there. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's true. Our neighboring state to the north, Nebraska, I don't know if that's the presentation that you heard, Jordan, but they did go super restrictive in Nebraska on panfish, and they actually did see an increase in harvest. So I think that is something that we need to consider. But again, that kind of just underscores our point that, the bag limits on those species are a sociological issue, and we might need more assistance from people that understand humans a little bit better than a lot of biologists do. And luckily, we do have a really great human dimensions expert in our department, Susan. She's in the middle there. So yeah, that's something that we definitely need to consider. Good point.
And another question here from Sharon. Is it true some species are looking at being renamed?
Are you referring to invasive carp? Maybe?
That would be my guess, but I'm not sure. There's no more details here.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's been a push recently to kind of rename or rebrand Asian carp as invasive carp. A more sensitive term. I guess if you have any other questions, you can type me in the chat.
And looks like we got about 1 minute if anyone else has any questions or comments for Jeff. If not, I'll point out you guys can find more information about the conference and whatever else you're looking for on the Kansas Water Office. They have a website and Twitter. That information is in the chat. Thank you, Deborah, for putting that up. Otherwise, thank you, Jeff, and all our other presenters. It's a fantastic session.